Looks like I need to turn some lights on. How are you doing?
I'm good, Tommy. I've muted myself until the meeting starts. It's live streaming currently, so.
Can you guys hear me? I'll be quiet.
Sir, we can hear you. All right, well, I'm showing 6 p.m., so I want to say thank you very much for joining us. Welcome. So we're definitely excited to get this information out with this code rewrite. It's been a 3-year process so far, so we're currently in phase 3 of about 5 phases total. So this is really the main part with having a consolidated draft. A lot of hard work has gone into this, a lot of work from the consultant staff, citizens, elected and appointed officials to get to this point. So we're hoping that by taking all that information into consideration, it's going to be a great land development code and a good fit for Richland County. So again, thank you very much for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Tim and Craig.
Great, thanks, Tommy. The way we have the meeting set out for this evening, those of us who are presenting the material, of course, will move through a PowerPoint presentation to present the new material to the county, and Craig will begin by doing an introduction to the presentation. A couple of things to note. Questions can be submitted during our presentation, and on each of the slides in the PowerPoint, the email address is at the bottom of the slide. So feel free to email questions as we're going through our presentation. I will note that there's about a 20-second lag from when we talk to when it's actually streamed on the county's YouTube channel. So we do have a bit of a lag, and that's just the way that it's set up in YouTube generally. So with that, I'll turn, I guess, do a quick introduction. I'm Tim Richards. I'm a principal with Clarion Associates. Our office is based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We also have an office in Denver, Colorado. My colleague, Craig Richardson, is also based in Chapel Hill. And we have been working with the county on this project to update the land development code, as Tommy mentioned, and are excited to be at a point in that project where we have a consolidated document, consolidated draft for the public to review. And so I'll turn it over to Craig now to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you, Tim. And as Tim said, it's great for us to be here. We have been working on this development code update project for a couple of years, and we are now at the point where we've got a complete draft of the development code. It's been a very structured process, and I'm going to go through that in a minute, but also to give you an idea of where we're going in this, Tim and my overview presentation is, first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project status and background. In other words, how we started, how we got to where we are today, and then where we are going, what we need to do to complete the project. After that, Tim is going to overview the module 2 materials. In other words, the second module, the last draft of the material for the completed development code, which is on the website the county has for this project. It's been on the website since March. And then while we were drafting the module 2 material, we got some direction from staff on some changes to module 1, which are also which we also made, and that's also in this material that's on the websites. And once we have reviewed that, we're going to conclude with next steps and then open the meeting up for any questions or comments that you might have. So with respect to the project status, where we have been and where we are going, the project has been organized into 5 tasks. We have completed the first 3 of those tasks and really done the heavy lifting. The latter 2 tasks shouldn't take a long time to complete. Once we receive input on the on this module 2 material, we started, for those who have not been involved in this process, and for those that have been but need a little bit of a refresher, we started in task 1. We called it project initiation, by us getting up to speed with your current development regulations. But in addition to that, and importantly, We also conducted a series of meetings with stakeholders, with the public, had meetings with staff, with your planning commission, with the council, asking you what changes you felt were most important to make in a development code update for the project to be successful. Based upon the comments we received on that, direction in your comprehensive plan, and we synthesized that information in a written document, the Land Development Code Assessment, where we identified 5 overriding goals or themes for the project, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. We then evaluated your existing regulations and tried to answer the question, how are your existing regulations doing in addressing these goals? In many instances, there were issues, there were things that hadn't been addressed. We identified those, and then we made some recommendations on changes that should be made, and concluded that document, that assessment, with an outline of what a new code would look like and entail if the issues we talked about were addressed. And that document was circulated. We had meetings with the public and the review board and the planning commission and some focus groups, and got input from everyone on that. Made some refinements, and then began the drafting of the code in task 3. We followed the outline that I mentioned that we included in that assessment with its refinements. It's a roadmap when we conducted the drafting, and did so in 2 modules. I'll talk about those 2 modules in a second. And we are now at the point where we are concluding that task 3 because we're conducting meetings on the module 2 material. We had meetings yesterday with an advisory committee, 3 focus groups. We met today with the planning commission, received their input, and we welcome your input at the meeting tonight. And we're planning to meet with your council on this in the near future. Once we get your input on this, and we are encouraging input over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to go ahead and launch testing of the development regulations we've drafted. And what I mean by the testing is we're actually going to identify 4 specific sites in the county, different locations, different types of development potential. And we are going to evaluate what type of development you could do on those sites under these new regulations versus what you could do under the old regulations. That material will be synthesized and released to the public for input, and we'll be having meetings on that. Once we receive input on that, once we receive input on module 2 information that we're talking about tonight, we'll get direction from staff and the planning commission and the elected officials about changes that need to be made to the draft. And we will produce a public hearing draft, and we are planning to do that in either late summer or early fall of this year. Along with that, we have developed, or we are in the process of developing, a zoning map. And the zoning map will be completed at the same time that the public hearing draft will be released. The zoning map identifies geographic places in the county where the zoning districts and the updated code will be put on, actually apply. So that generally is where we have gone, where we've been, where we are now, and where we are planning to go to complete this project in the next 4 or 5 months. With respect to, but before Tim talks about the overview of module 2, there are 2 other points that I would like to make. Number 1 is I talked about the key goals that were identified early in the process during the assessment stage. we always like to, as we are drafting a code and completing a module, go back and look at those goals and ask the question, are we achieving these goals? And there are 5 of them, as I mentioned. The first one, create a user-friendly code. We've done a number of things to do that in this update. We've restructured the development regulations into a more intuitive structure where we have consolidated the procedures, integrated and consolidated the zoning districts and the use regulations, and then consolidated the development standards, both the zoning development standards and the subdivision development standards. We've added a lot of graphics and tables. We've clarified language. We've added definitions to provide more certainty and understanding to the language in the code. Implementing the plan, the new plan that was adopted, is also very important. And we've done that in a number of ways too, primarily in the revising of the zoning districts, which is in Article 3 of the draft code, and also in the revision, and is in Module 1, and also in the revisions we've made to the zoning development standards in Module 2. For example, one of the things we did was we added mixed-use districts, which was directed by your plan. Along those same lines, another thing that we have also, while we have updated the zoning districts to implement the plan, we've also looked at the zoning districts and modernized them. In other words, we have, where there was overlap, we've tried to simplify by consolidating some districts where it made sense. In other instances, we have just modernized the uses, or made some refinements to some of the dimensional standards to deal with development issues that exist today. Done something similar with respect to your development standards, which was the 4th goal. For example, one of the things we did in updating your parking standards was we looked at your off-street parking requirements and made some refinements to them based upon a lot of parking studies that have been done over the last decade and other best practices. Finally, in addressing this 5th goal, encouraging green development practices, we have included a section in the development standards that provide incentives for developers that want to incorporate green building practices. What I mean by green building practices, and this is defined in that section, are things like energy conservation practices, use of alternative energy, water conservation practices, practices to support urban agriculture, recycling provisions, building to lead or comparable standards, and things of that nature. Now, these are incentives. They are optional. Someone doesn't have to do that, but we provided incentives for folks that do. Finally, and before Tim talks about the overview of the standards, and Tim, if you could go to that next section. This slide shows the new development code structure. There are 9 articles in that first module. We addressed and consolidated the procedures in Article 2, administration. We drafted the zoning districts in Article 3. And then we consolidated nonconformities and enforcement in Article 7 and 8. And in Article 9, we included definitions that were relevant to those articles. The second module focuses on the use regulations in Article 4, which is basically identifies the uses that are allowed in different forms in each of the zoning districts, as well as special rules for certain uses to go into certain zoning districts. And then in Article 5, we consolidated all of the, use the term general development standards, that's zoning development standards like parking and landscaping, open space requirements, signage, lighting, and the like. And then Article 6, where we've consolidated the land development standards. So that is the content. These Article 4, 5, and 6 is the primary content of Module 2, along with we've added definitions in the definition section that we needed for those regulations. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tim, who is going to overview the article or Module 2 materials for you.
Great, thank you, Craig. And just for those of you who have been participating in this process all along and participated in the Module 1 meetings, so this is the next set of meetings. In other words, the consolidated draft, we didn't have separate meetings on Module 2. This is the presentation of the Module 2 material. So I'll go through each of these 3 articles and try and highlight for you the main changes from the current land development code, and also any new material that we've added. I'll try and highlight for you on what those changes in new material are. And then finally, as Craig mentioned, as we put the 2 modules together into one document, we did make a few modifications to Module 1 material that we've already has already been out and reviewed by the public. So we wanted to highlight what those changes are. So first I'll talk about the use regulations. As Craig mentioned, this is a zoning ordinance, land development code, divides the land in the county into different zoning districts, and then importantly regulates what uses can be established in the various zoning districts. So the use regulations have been reorganized in this consolidated draft from how they are currently in the land development code. So currently, the use table is in the zoning district article. The specific standards for the different principal uses are in the next article in the land development code. And then there are standards for accessory and temporary uses that are in yet another article in the current land development code. What we've done is pulled all that together into one article, Article 26-4. And you can see that organization on the right side of the screen. And so I'd like to talk mainly about, you can see it's similar between the principal uses, the accessory uses and structures, and the temporary uses and structures, in that there is a use table, and I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. And then there are standards for the specific uses. So as far as defining the different uses of land, there are some changes in this consolidated draft that I would like to highlight. Number one is that all of the uses are defined in this draft. Currently in Land Development Code, it does define a number of uses, but there are other instances where it relies on the federal government's classification system, the NAICS, to provide organization and to define the uses. And so we've eliminated those references, that reference to the NAICS, and instead, as I mentioned, defined all the uses in the ordinance. That's number one. Number two, the method we've used to define the uses is a 3-tiered method, and this is discussed in the code assessment. So it includes a high-level use classification. So for example, commercial is a use classification, another is residential, another is industrial. So at a very high level. Then below that, there are a number of categories in each use classification. So the commercial use classification includes retail sales as a use category. And so then underneath each category, you have the different uses listed So convenience store is an example of a type of retail sales use. So this is a three-tier organization. And we've found that this is a more robust way of defining uses that allows staff, that allows users of the code more guidance in interpreting what is or is not a specific use in the regulation. So that's a change in how principal uses are defined. Now, I told you I'd show you an excerpt of the use table. So this is an excerpt of the use table in this current draft. So you can see traveler accommodations is one of the use categories. And then below that, you have a number of different uses: hotels, bed and breakfast. So changes in the use table from the current land development code. Number one, there are a number of new uses that are included. So an example of that is the farmer's market use in this graphic on the slide. So there are new uses included. Also, in many cases, we consolidated existing uses. So an example of that in this graphic is a consumer goods store, where you had a number of retail uses that were defined, or I shouldn't say defined, that were listed separately in the current land development ordinance. What we did is if the impacts of those uses were very similar, you know, and these aren't specific ones, but this is just sort of the idea: a candy store, a toy store, where the impacts were similar, and we felt that the uses didn't need to be sliced so thinly, and we've consolidated those uses into more general uses. And so what that means is, in this use table, the different cells on one of those consolidated uses under the various zoning districts may have had some discrepancies in how those uses are treated, resolved in the way you see in the current use table. So, and you'll notice that there are a number of footnotes for the use table that provide information about what those specific changes were. And then finally, I will say that there were a number of uses that were simply carried forward from the current land development code. In some cases, we did make some modifications in what districts they were allowed in. And again, I would refer you to the footnotes for that information. So that's the use table in what I call the use permissions: what uses are allowed where and what type of approval is required. The use standards, if you look on the rightmost column of this example table, you can see that there are references, cross-references to different sections in the regulations in the land development code, where there are specific standards for specific uses. And you have these now in your land development code. What has changed is that, number one, the organization now matches the use table. So the various headings and hierarchy and structure of the use table is now reflected in the use standards. So they're organized the same as in the use table. That's number one. Number two, a number of standards were updated, and where there were uses consolidated, in some cases we had to reconcile the different use standards for the various uses that were consolidated. So a lot of updating and a lot of modernizing and revising carried forward and consolidated use standards. And then finally, where there were new uses introduced, in many cases we also included new standards for those uses. So you can see that farmers market is a new use, and it has standards associated with it that are cross-referenced in that rightmost column. So that's a really brief overview of the Article 26-4 use regulations. Now that's the first of the three new articles. So I want to talk next about Article 26-5, Now, these are the general development standards. And what this article does is consolidates all the development standards in the Land Development Code into one article. And a number of these will look familiar to you, those of you who have used the Land Development Code or are familiar with the Land Development Code. So you have landscaping regulations currently, you have regulations currently. Some of them are sign regulations. Some of them will look different. So for example, neighborhood compatibility is a new section, a new set of standards. So what I'd like to do now is in the next 7 or 8 slides, go through these, set of these standards are carried forward from your current ordinance, but there are also some new ones. So what do we mean by access? So for example, points of access onto a roadway, what are the spacing requirements for those? I need to put a driveway to connect to a road. What are the width requirements for that driveway? So that's the access component. As far as mobility, so we've included a general requirement that new development have a circulation system in place for not only automobile traffic, but also for the movement of pedestrians and bicyclists. And also that those circulation systems in new development connect to connection points outside of the development, so that there's a better network in new development. And so a part of that is the connectivity standards. And so what connectivity standards do is require a minimum level of connectivity. In other words, street intersections, you have to have a certain, meet a certain threshold, for example, in a new residential subdivision of connectivity. You have to have a certain number you have to have a certain robustness of the network. And in addition to that, you have to have good connectivity to the road system outside of the subdivision. So there are requirements for access points into and out of the new subdivision. So that's an example of connectivity. And you can see in the diagram or the graphic on the slide on the right, the red circles highlight points of cross access, and that's another component of connectivity. Actually all three: access, mobility, and connectivity, because if you're able to have these points of access between adjoining developments, that means that if you are moving from one to the other, you don't have to get back onto the roadway, and you can have that movement internal to this development. So cross access is another important component. And finally, the traffic impact assessment requirement in the current Land Development Code is carried forward. What that means is that development of a certain meets a certain threshold, an assessment has to be completed for that development to determine what the traffic impacts are likely to be of that development. That's carried forward from the current Land Development Code. So that's access, mobility, and connectivity. Off-street parking and loading. Craig mentioned the change in the minimum standards in off-street parking. So currently, I want to do I want to put in a, retail store. How many parking spaces do I have to provide for that? Well, those are the minimum standards. And where there's currently one set of standards that applies throughout the county, doesn't matter where you're putting in your store, you have the same parking requirements. What we've done is we've split that into 2 sets of standards. And so there's a set of minimum standards that apply in most areas of the county. But then in a few targeted areas where walkability is a priority and where more urban forms of development are desired, then there's another set of parking standards that requires actually less parking in these areas, with the understanding that they will be less auto-dependent and more walkable places. So that's one change. Secondly, we've simplified the impervious mitigation provisions. What that means is if I'm providing more parking than what is required currently under the Land Development Code, once I reach a certain threshold, I have to start mitigating that impervious area that I'm adding by having more infiltration of stormwater on the site. So you know, some of the low impact development types of strategies to try and have more groundwater, or sorry, more stormwater infiltrate on the site. So that's the current arrangement. What we did was in the parking table for each use currently, that threshold where I have to start providing that mitigation is defined for each use. We found that it generally fell within a rough percentage of the minimum parking. And so what we did was we simplified it and just it said if you're above 120% of the minimum parking, then you have to start providing these mitigation measures. And if you're above 150% of the minimum parking, then any additional parking has to have impervious surface. And so it's a simplification, but also carrying forward the current arrangement. One change that we did make is there now are maximum parking standards in the MU2 and the MU3 districts. So these are those districts I mentioned that are designed or intended to be more walkable, more urban places. In those areas, there's actually a maximum. In other words, you cannot include more parking than 120% of what the minimum is generally in the county. Okay, so there's now a parking maximum in these places. And again, these are intended to be more walkable, more urban areas. So that's new. Also, there is now a way to calculate the parking required for a mixed-use development. So a mixed-use development could be a combination of office, retail, you know, entertainment use, maybe some residential as well, all in one development. So that sort of development, you know, rather than having to sum the minimum parking requirements for each of those uses together and provide that amount of parking, what this calculation does is take into account that the parking demands for the different uses might generally be different throughout the different times of the day. So I may have more parking demand for residential use in the evening, but less during the day, and I might have more parking demand for office use, but less for residential during the day as well. So what that does is this calculation takes those differences in parking demand into account and recognizes that the same parking space could serve both uses. So this is a new calculation, and a developer could apply that calculation to a mixed-use project and not have to go through an expensive traffic or an extensive parking study and figure out what the minimum parking is that way, you know, built into the code. So those are some changes. Another change is a new set of standards for large parking lots, and you can see the picture on the right shows an example of a drive aisle. So parking lots that are over 300 spaces have to comply with this set of standards. So these are fairly large parking lots. And what the standards requires, number one, this primary drive aisle along the front of the parking lot, where you have essentially a lot of the characteristics of a walkable sort of a street, where you have parallel parking, where you have street trees. Another requirement for these large parking lots is pedestrian walkways from the parking area to the building entrance, and there's a requirement for spacing of these pedestrian walkways and trees along the walkway. So the idea is to break up these larger parking lots to make them more walkable areas. That's a change. Another change are some of the flexibility provisions. Now, what do I mean by flexibility provisions? Well, my store, I don't want to provide, or I'm not able to provide all the parking that I am required to on that site right now, or I don't think I need to provide that much. So you currently have a number of provisions that allow some flexibility, where you might be able to share parking with an existing use. Also, you have some off-site parking allowances, where I could have parking a couple of lots down. And so what we've done is refined those, we've enhanced those. For example, the off-site parking provisions now require a certain degree of walkability. So there will be, a safe pedestrian environment between the parking and the use that it serves. We've also included some new flexibility provisions like valet parking, like deferred parking, where you can set aside the land for a portion of the parking if you can show that parking will likely not be needed, and then you can a year down the road after the use has been established, determine whether that parking needs to be installed or not, or whether that land can be repurposed. That's deferred parking. So there's a number of provisions like that that allow flexibility. Finally, as far as automobiles are concerned, stacking space standards. And you currently have some standards for drive-throughs to make sure that as cars queue up, there's sufficient space for them. We've updated those. We've also included some stacking space standards for parking lot entrances, where often cars may queue up as well, coming into a parking lot. And then bicycle parking standards have also been included. And these apply in certain areas, certain zoning districts in the county. And they require a certain amount of bicycle parking to be provided for new development. And we looked at the City of Columbia bicycle parking standards. These are not the same standards, but they do, well, in some cases we did borrow from those standards, but the concepts are very similar. And so those have been enhanced and updated as well and consolidated. Moving on to landscaping. So a lot of small changes in landscaping, and I'll just run through these fairly quickly. So the maintenance provisions, how you have to maintain your landscaping, those were refined and revised. There's species diversity standards currently in the land development code that require a certain diversity in the tree species that are planted in landscaping. And we've extended those diversity standards also to shrubs that are planted. The transitional buffer yard standards, that has been simplified. Pardon me for a minute. So those transitional buffer yard standards have been simplified in that currently you have to refer to, I believe, 2 or 3 separate tables to determine what type of transitional buffer yard you need to provide when you're going to develop a parcel of land, and you have to take into account the abutting parcels and figure out what type of buffer you need between you and them. What we've done is made it so that you only have to consult one table to figure out the buffer type. Then there's another table that tells you what your options are for providing that buffer. And those options depend on the width of the buffer. That tells you the types of plantings and that you need to include, or the number of plantings you need to include in the buffer. It's landscape. So, and then you know, in that table that tells you the plantings related to buffer width, you know, we've also tried to standardize that so that the metrics are the same from the different buffer types. Currently, they're a little bit different. So, relatively modest changes, but we think a vast improvement as far as usability and user friendliness of those regulations and clarity. As far as the street protective yard refinements and parking lot landscaping standards clarifications, now those are, for the most part, clarifications in the regulations, and in the case of street protective yards, some consolidation from a couple of places in the land development code. The new site landscaping standards are illustrated in this on this slide on the right side. You can see that you know, this is the bird's eye view of new development, and there are requirements for a certain number of plantings in new development, and the general configuration is intended to soften the visual impact of the foundation of the building. And so you can see that there are requirements for trees that are based on the acreage of the land developed, and then the shrub requirements are based on the building perimeter. So those are new. Also, the tree protection standards have been refined and updated. So going through those fairly quickly, the definition of protected tree has been modified, and additional trees have been included in that. So for example, the tree diameter has been is smaller for that threshold to be considered a protected tree. A tree removal permit is now explicitly referenced and required. And you may recall in Module 1, we had a procedure for a tree removal permit. And there are some exceptions where you wouldn't have to get that permit. There is a requirement for a documentation of existing trees in the landscaping plan. And finally, there are new requirements during construction for how these protected trees have to be protected so that they're not damaged as construction proceeds on the site. Open space set-asides is a new set of standards, and this is based on a recommendation and that's laid out in the code assessment. Open space set-asides are a new mandatory requirement. Should say there is now a mandatory minimum open space set-aside requirement in new development. And what that minimum open space is depends on, number one, the type of development, and then number two, where the development is located. So the requirements for a multifamily development would be different from a commercial development, and they would be different in one part of the county versus you know, in other zoning districts in the county. So those standards are tailored to the use and the location. And how do you meet those standards? So what qualifies for as open space? And you can see this image on the right of the slide shows you different types of open space. So the ordinance describes various types of open space. For example, you can see a path or a trail on that graphic. And then it includes standards for design and maintenance of each specific type. and also includes some general standards for design and maintenance of open space, and also for ownership of open space to make sure that it continues as usable open space. I will note that we included where natural features are included as open space, and that's one type of open space set aside. In those cases, there are standards that are carried forward from the current land development code that would apply to those natural features that are used to meet this set-aside requirement. So that's a new section. Another new section is conservation development. And this section, or these standards, provide relaxed dimensional standards, as well as an increase in density. So whereas in zoning districts currently, you may be required to have a minimum lot width. The lot has to be at least X number of feet wide, and you have a set density. You can have more dense development, and you don't have that minimum lot width requirement anymore, and you have reduced setbacks, so you have a lot more flexibility in how you lay out the development. But in return for that additional density and relaxed dimensional standards, you have a set of requirements for conservation area. You have to conserve a certain percentage of the land for conservation, and then within those conservation areas, there are standards that apply. And I'll mention, you can see in that second bullet, that some of the standards in the Land Development Code currently have been carried forward for open space development. Those have been carried forward in this conservation development set of standards. And there are also standards for the areas that are developed. So that's, again, an option to someone who wanted to come in and develop in a more flexible way and achieve that density and flexibility in standards. Design and form standards are also new. These are standards that apply to new multifamily as well as commercial, mixed use, and light industrial development. So these are new standards, and you can see in that picture to the right, and that's probably the easiest way to understand these. So they address things like building orientation, and you can see that this is an example of from the multifamily design and form standards. The building entrances are oriented towards the street or towards the courtyard there. So that's what we mean by building orientation. You know, the commercial and mixed use and light industrial standards have different orientation requirements that apply where you have multiple buildings like this. So building orientation is one thing that's addressed. Also building design. You can see the multifamily buildings have pitched roofs. They have some variation in the facade of the building. So it's not just a flat, plain facade. So in the design and the form of the building, there are requirements. And this sets a minimum standard for development quality throughout the county for these types of development. This is a new section. Also new, the neighborhood compatibility standards apply to non-residential, mixed use, and multifamily development when it takes place adjacent to single-family residential lots. By that, I mean existing single-family or two-family structures, and I mean lots that are undeveloped or vacant, but in one of the lower density single-family zoning districts. So when the new non-residential mixed-use or multifamily development comes in adjacent to one of these lots, the neighborhood compatibility standards require that the building be designed in certain ways that are sensitive to the residential development. I should say that provide an appropriate transition to the residential development. So things like building height, the design of the building, having a pitched roof versus a flat roof. Also the exterior walls of the building. You can see that there's a certain amount of visibility. It's not just a blank wall in this graphic on the right, and some variability in the facade of the building. They also address things like exterior lighting, signage, where the parking is located, where storage and waste collection is located, and also operations, when the hours of outdoor dining is allowed, when music can be amplified music can be played on played on the site. So these are all neighborhood compatibility standards, a new section. Agricultural compatibility is also a new section. These standards apply to all development that is adjacent to the new agricultural district. So you can see an example on the right here where you have a new residential subdivision that is adjacent to an existing agricultural use. And so what you see is a buffer between the residential use and the agricultural use. You see a feathering of the lots next to the agricultural use. In other words, the larger lots are adjacent to the agricultural use. And then smaller lots are further away. But there are also notification requirements, so that people who buy lots in this new residential subdivision will be have some notification of the agricultural use, and this is in the form of on the subdivision plat, a note on the subdivision plat, stating that there's an agricultural use, and there may be some impacts from that use on this new development. This is intended to reduce those impacts so that the agricultural use can continue to be viable where it's established. So these three sections I'll go through fairly quickly because they mainly are carrying forward what you have currently. The main changes are in the fence and wall standards. Fences and walls, there are currently height limits for fences and walls. We carried those forward. We've included some new standards for materials, so what you can build a fence out of. For the appearance of the fence, you can see that the more finished side of this fence in the graphic on this slide faces out from the lot. Also for maintenance of fences. And then there are security exemptions where if you need a taller fence or a fence that incorporates, razor wire or something like that for security reasons, then you can apply for a security exemption. Signs we've carried forward the current standards with some minor refinements. Exterior lighting is also carried forward from the current land development code, again with some refinements, and those are footnoted in the draft. I'm sorry, if you're interested in those areas, I'd encourage you to look at the footnotes and see what those refinements are. As far as water quality standards, this section consolidates the water quality buffer requirements, stormwater management, and the NPDES requirements, all into one section. Again, with refinements, but no substantive changes. Finally, Craig mentioned this earlier, the green development incentives. So this provides incentives in the form of increase in height or density, a decrease in the minimum lot area for non-residential and mixed-use structure, or a reduction in the minimum parking. And so a developer could achieve any of these incentives using the menu of green building features. And you can see an excerpt of that on the right. So energy conservation is one of the areas where there are green building feature options that a developer could choose from. So this is a very flexible approach that allows a developer to incorporate some of these features in return for the incentives. And again, this is consistent with the recommendations in the code assessment and with the directions in Plan Richland County. Finally, in this section, the 14th of the 14 sections, general performance standards. These are carried forward from the current ordinance. And so they address things like noise, vibration, odor, toxic, hazardous, and radioactive material. It's a very short section, but these are just some very basic performance standards that are carried forward. So we've gone through 2 of the 3 articles. As far as Article 26-6, which is the land development subdivision standards, these standards have been carried forward from the Land Development Code with a couple of notable changes that this slide highlights. Number 1, block length. The block length is reduced, minimum block length is reduced to 300 feet. So whereas now, the shortest block you can have in a new subdivision has to be 600 feet long. That's reduced to 300 feet. So it's a shorter blocks are allowed. Also, the maximum block length, which is currently 1,800 feet. So you could have a block up to 1,800 feet long. Now you can have a block up to 1,200 feet long. So that's been reduced as well. And this tends to improve the connectivity within new subdivisions, walkability. So that's one change. Secondly, private street maintenance. So we have included new requirements for the owners association to have responsibility for maintaining private streets. Also, we've deleted a provision that allowed the development review team to require additional unspecified natural resource protections based on the natural resource assessment that happens in the subdivision process. And we deleted that provision because, as I said, it is a not specific requirement, a very vague requirement. And so that requirement has been deleted. We also updated the surety provisions. So when a road is not improved and the final plat is ready to be recorded, how are those performance guarantees established, and how does that process occur? So we've updated that section as well as the required improvements. So those are the 3 new sections in Module 2. Now I mentioned as we put these 2 modules together into this consolidated draft, we did make some revisions based on input received on Module 1. And also based on the new material that was drafted, where we may have had placeholders in the Module 1 draft. So a couple of changes that I'll move through fairly quickly. The administration, Article 26-2 administration, we included the water quality buffer waiver procedure. This is not a change, it's just moving the procedure out of the standards and into this procedures section. Also, we did fill in some placeholders for administrative adjustments. In other words, these are small changes that can be made administratively to some of the development standards. Well, which development standards? We had a placeholder because we hadn't drafted the development standards yet in Module 2. Now that they're drafted, we've filled in that placeholder. And similarly for variances. As far as the zoning districts, again, we had a placeholder for the new agricultural district. We filled that in and included standards for the agricultural district. Also, a number of the districts were renamed. And so you'll see that the residential districts are now the R1 through the R6 districts, the mixed use districts, which were are now the M1 through the M3 districts. Also, the land preservation district has changed to the open space district. So those are the main changes in Article 26-3. Article 26-8, enforcement. The sign enforcement provisions have been were taken out of the sign standards and put in with the enforcement provisions. And this is consistent with the approach that we've taken to try and consolidate all like things together within the code. It's a better organization and people know where to go to find enforcement provisions. They're in the enforcement article. Also, the enforcement provisions for open space set aside maintenance were added in because that's a new section and it had some enforcement provisions. As far as the Article 26.9 definitions, rules of construction, and rules of measurement, we included a new rule for how you measure block length. I mentioned the block length standards have been modified and there's now a rule for how you would measure that. There's a provision in the initial draft of Module 1 that allowed for encroachments into the right-of-way. That provision was removed in this consolidated draft. You can still have encroachments into setbacks, and those are defined in that same section. But those specific provisions pertaining to the right-of-way encroachments were not carried forward, or not from that Module 1 draft. And then finally, new definitions have been included in this section for all of this material, new material in Module 2. So that's an overview of the high points. It's a lot of material, and I've tried to emphasize what I think are the most important changes in new material for you. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Craig to wrap up the presentation. And Craig, let me unmute you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Tim. As I said, one of the things we are encouraging everyone to do is, if you do, please review this material. It's important. These development codes, once they're adopted, stay in place for many years. And they do have an impact on how development occurs in the county. But if you review the material and you have specific comments, there is a place on the website you can go and you can provide your written comments to us. We would encourage everyone, if they do want to provide written comments, to please do so in the next 3 or 4 weeks. We would really like to stay on schedule in terms of completing the code and getting it ready for a public hearing. At the same time, while that's going on, while you're reviewing the code, we are going to complete the testing over the next 4 to 6 weeks. And we will be synthesizing the results of that, and that will be provided to you for review and comment, and we'll be conducting some meetings on the testing results. Once that's been done, we've received comments on that, direction from the community on changes that need to be made to Module 2 and based upon the testing. And even in Module 1, if you have any comments, additional comments on Module 1, we will make those revisions and then produce a public hearing draft. And as I said earlier, we're targeting to have that completed by the end of the summer, early part of the fall. And we'll also be producing a zoning map, which will identify what lands will be zoned, placed in different districts. So those are the next steps. Thank you for your participation and attention, and then we'll be taking questions and any comments. So Tim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Craig. Now, as we've been going throughout this presentation, you'll notice that there, and I mentioned that there is an email address where you can email questions. I believe there's also questions submitted on the YouTube channel. So I'll turn it over to Tommy now. Actually, Tommy, if you want to read the questions that have been submitted, and then we'll go through those and address those.
Yes, sir. So I'll start with the first one. I'm going to generalize it a little bit because they had some specific locations in there, so I don't want to, give out any information that's extra. But the first email says we live in a single-family residence and within a subdivision. My neighbors and I are opposed to zoning changes in our immediate neighborhood and the surrounding area as well. That would permit commercial and mixed use, residential and commercial on the same property. So will the land development code address permitted land uses in our neighborhood and surrounding area? And if yes, what is the process to file our opposition to commercial or mixed residential and commercial uses being allowed in our area?
So that's a good question, and probably a question that a lot of people have. Craig mentioned the zoning map that is moving forward in conjunction with this draft of the text of the land development code. Of course, they're two separate things. In other words, the land development code lays out the different districts, and then of course the zoning map defines the boundaries of those districts geographically. And so if your question, I believe, is regarding to the definition of the boundaries geographically. Of course, I mentioned the use table that lays out the different uses that are allowed in the different districts. That's definitely part of this draft document we're talking about today. The question about what boundaries will be located where, that will be addressed in the zoning map. And as Craig mentioned, that is under development, currently being refined by county staff. That will be put out for the public to review, and there will be a process for people to weigh in on what those proposed designations are. There are new zoning districts in this land development code. There are districts currently that are not carried forward in this land development code, so there have to be changes to the zoning map. And so that's the reason for that process of creating the new zoning map. But so the answer to your question is yes. That situation is addressed indirectly in this land development code draft and very directly in the zoning map. Anything that you would add, Craig?
I think you covered it well.
Okay.
All right, so for our next email, we've got some questions and some comments, mainly about climate resiliency measures. So basically the comment said the plan falls very short of protections from downwind and downstream neighbors from development and flooding. There should be more protections, wetlands, and great reduction of any building in floodplains. Kind of what sources of data have been used to determine decisions about building within the floodplain. Also, as far as for under the administration chart of responsibilities, floodplain development, why are there no appeals authority procedures listed? I can kind of stop there if you kind of want to address a couple of those comments prior to going on.
Those are good questions. I mean, the technical aspects of the floodplain regulations are sort of outside of the scope of this process. As you know, the floodplain regulations require approval from the federal government, and that's a sort of a separate process from this update. That's I think the short answer to your question about the floodplain regulations. Anything you would add to that, Craig?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay. And Tom, was there more? Sorry, there was a question about a procedural question.
Yes, sir, that's correct. It's the appeals authority under the charter responsibilities for basically development within the floodplain.
And I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. It has to do with an appeals procedure for floodplain determinations. Is that correct? Is that your understanding, Tommy?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, we can certainly take a look at that to make sure that it's consistent with what you have currently. Our intent was not to change that. As I mentioned, those regulations are approved by the federal government to ensure they comply with the flood insurance program. So we'll certainly take a look at that. The intent was not to make any changes to that appeals procedure.
And then as part of that email as well, it also asks what protections are forced included in the plan.
Can you say that again, Tommy?
I'm sorry, just trying to paraphrase it a little bit. So what protections for forest are included in the plan?
Okay, for forest. Yes, absolutely. Well, the tree protection standards that I mentioned do come into play. Now, there is an exemption for forestry activities. So if there is a bona fide forestry operation, then the tree protection standard would not apply. Those activities are exempt. However, if the forestry activity is clear cutting in anticipation for development, then that situation is addressed. And actually, this we didn't mention at the beginning of the meeting, but we have had meetings, with the Planning Commission earlier today, with several groups on this consolidated draft, and that question did come up. And so there is a provision that would limit the ability to submit development applications for a period of time. I believe it's a year after the clear cutting activity takes place. If someone wanted to transition land from forestry to something else and develop it, so that would come into play. But the short answer is bona fide forestry activities are exempt from the tree protection standards.
And just to go back briefly about the appeal for the floodplain development. So currently that table 26-2.2 states that the appeal, the decision is made by the floodplain coordinator, and then that appeal would go to the county administrator. So I did want to answer that since I was able to scroll and find that. Let's see. And then our next question is about the standard review procedures for addressing the public. Mainly just a comment about designating that public meetings being public, and that online measures are insufficient, and that pre-application for neighborhood meetings are optional, and that these meetings should be required.
The pre-application conference or the pre-application neighborhood meeting?
The neighborhood meetings.
Okay. Okay. Well, we appreciate that comment. I'm looking at the ordinance right now. It looks like they are okay. So they're encouraged but not required. And so, are there, there may be specific types of development where this individual would feel like the pre-application meeting would be particularly important. I mean, that would be helpful. And again, you can see the comment form that's up on this slide here, and we would encourage you, if you have specific types of development review you think that would be should be required for, we would recommend that you submit that comment and let us know what those are.
All right, so our next question is, have the buffers for water conduits, streams, creeks, rivers, natural ponds been increased to control runoff? And what is the regulation for ensuring these riparian buffers are vegetated?
So the first answer is no, they have not been increased. The second answer is they are the same standards that currently are in the land development code for the water quality buffer requirement. So there are requirements for vegetation, there's some restoration standards, and those are the same as in the current land development code.
All right, and our next question came from the YouTube chat. Do the landscaping standards prioritize native species?
That's a great question. They do not require native species. They encourage native species. In other words, the regulation is not that you have to use native species, but so no, they don't require native species.
All right, and I have not received any additional comments at this time.
Okay. Well, we appreciate everyone who has participated remotely. You know, these meetings were intended to be in-person public meetings, as we've done previously, and they were initially scheduled for the end of March. And of course, that did not happen with the limitations on gatherings that are in place currently. So this is our best effort to try and reach out to the members of the community and present this material in a way that hopefully will be beneficial to them and help them understand and provide input. As Craig mentioned, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we would encourage you, if you have specific comments on this draft document, to submit them. There's a comment form on the website. This presentation, a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation, will also be available on the website weplantogether.org, and anyone can download this draft if you haven't yet downloaded it. And I would encourage you to look through it. Of course, the electronic copy includes hyperlinks and a table of you know, a bookmarks to be able to navigate the document. So we'd encourage you to download that document also from weplantogether.org. And with that, we appreciate everyone's participation this evening, and all of the IT and staff at the county that made this live stream possible. And thank you for your interest, and I wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you.
Good job. Have a good evening.